She marched onto our private property like she owned the mountainside, barking orders and waving a clipboard like it was a badge. But the moment she crossed that threshold, she had no idea my wife, a federal officer on leave, was waiting inside with handcuffs. If you love justice served cold and real-life takedowns, smash that like button and hit subscribe for more true stories you won't believe. It had been a long time coming. Alyssa and I had talked about this cabin for years, fantasizing about a place where we could unplug from the constant churn of city life, where we could wake up to the sound of birds instead of car horns and fall asleep under a sky full of stars instead of neon. The moment the ink dried on the deed, we loaded up the SUV with the essentials and made the 4-hour drive into the mountains, winding our way through tree-lined roads until civilization melted behind us. What greeted us was more than we could have imagined. The cabin itself was older, clearly built with care by someone who knew how to use their hands. Weathered pine siding, a deep porch lined with rocking chairs, and a stone chimney that seemed to rise like a monument to another time. It sat on a gentle slope overlooking a small lake. The water, still and glassy, reflected the summer sky in a way that made it look like we had parked ourselves on the edge of a postcard. Inside, the place had the kind of charm you can't buy at big-box furniture stores. Exposed beams ran across the ceiling, and everything smelled faintly of cedar and old campfire smoke. It wasn't fancy, not by any means, but it was clean, sturdy, and private. That last word was the one that mattered most to both of us: privacy. A break from the meetings, the deadlines, the back-to-back phone calls, and the constant noise of people needing something. Alyssa needed it more than I did, though she'd never say so. Her job didn't end when she clocked out. Being a federal officer meant the stress followed her home, even if she managed to leave the paperwork at the office. She wore it in her shoulders, in the way she scanned every restaurant before choosing a seat, always keeping her back to the wall and her eyes on the exits. Here, she could breathe. Here, she could finally relax. Or at least, we thought she could. The first 2 days passed exactly as we'd hoped. I spent hours on the porch, reading novels I'd been putting off for years. Alyssa hiked trails and fished in the lake, her usual edge softening with each passing hour. At night, we cooked simple meals over the fire pit and told each other the kind of stories we never had time for in our day-to-day lives. It felt like we had stumbled into a small, forgotten paradise. We met our first neighbor on the 3rd day. His name was Hank, a retiree who lived just a few cabins down. He introduced himself while I was unpacking a few folding chairs from the back of the car, walking over with the slow confidence of someone who knew the area better than most. He was wiry, with weathered skin and sharp eyes, the kind of man who could tell you the forecast better than any weatherman just by sniffing the wind. He seemed friendly enough. We exchanged pleasantries, talked about fishing spots, and he gave us a few tips on local wildlife to keep an eye out for. Before he left, he paused and looked at the cabin thoughtfully, like it reminded him of something. "You folks got a nice place here," he said. "Solid bones. Just keep an eye out for the HOA lady. She's a character." I laughed, assuming he was joking. I asked what kind of HOA even existed this far out in the woods. We hadn't seen any signs, no gated entrances or posted rules. He just shook his head. "That's the thing. It's not official, not really, but she acts like it is." I pressed for details, but Hank waved it off like he'd said enough already. Maybe he didn't want to get involved, or maybe he thought we'd figure it out soon enough on our own. Either way, he tipped his hat and headed down the path toward his own place, leaving us with the first tiny scratch in what had otherwise been a flawless experience. I brought it up to Alyssa that evening while we were roasting hot dogs. She listened with one eyebrow raised, sipping from a tin cup of wine and glancing toward the edge of the tree line, as if the so-called HOA lady might materialize then and there. "Unofficial hoe," she repeated. "What does that even mean?" "Beats me," I said. But Hank seemed serious. Alyssa smirked. "Well, if anyone tries anything shady, they'll regret picking the wrong cabin." That was one thing I loved about her. She never made a show of her profession, never flashed her badge to win an argument or threw around her title like it meant she was above anyone else. But when pushed, she knew how to stand her ground, and she was very, very good at spotting trouble before it had a name. Still, we didn't think much of it. We figured Hank was just being neighborly, maybe even overly cautious. We certainly didn't expect anything that could ruin the peace we had come all this way to find. That night, the wind picked up. Not a storm, just enough to rustle the branches and whistle through the cracks in the window frames. I was reading by lantern light when Alyssa turned in early, the kind of deep, satisfying sleep that only came when she felt safe. I stayed up a little longer, listening to the wind and watching the moonlight move across the wooden floor. It wasn't until the next morning, when I walked out to collect firewood, that I noticed something strange. A set of footprints in the dirt fresh, not from me or Alyssa. They led from the road up to the side of the cabin, right beneath the living room window, and then back again. I stared at them for a long time. They weren't the kind of footprints someone made while cutting through a yard. These were deliberate, slow, as if someone had stopped and stood there for a while, watching. I called Alyssa out and pointed them out to her. She crouched to examine the impressions, her mood shifting instantly. The calm of the past few days drained from her face, replaced by something sharper. She didn't say anything right away, just took her phone out and snapped a few pictures. "Could be nothing," I offered, though I didn't believe it. "Could be," she said, "but I don't like being watched." Neither did I. Whatever piece we had found was beginning to fray, and we hadn't even seen a face yet. We had come to the mountains for quiet, for rest, for time away from the world. But already the shadows were shifting, and something or someone was paying a little too much attention. The next morning, the world felt just a little different. The sun still rose over the ridgeline in that beautiful, golden way it had since we arrived, but the feeling had changed. I no longer sipped my coffee in easy silence while looking out at the lake. I scanned the tree line. Every gust of wind felt like a footstep. Every bird call seemed too sharp, too sudden. Alyssa, never one to ignore a shift in atmosphere, had woken up already alert. She didn't stretch lazily like the day before or smile at me before reaching for her coffee. She was up and dressed quickly, already in that subtle rhythm she had whenever she felt something was off. It was the rhythm I saw in her before interviews, interrogations, or when she walked into a room where she knew someone was lying. We didn't say much. The footprints still bothered us both. I kept telling myself they were probably harmless. Maybe a lost hiker, or some nosy local. But that didn't sit well with Alyssa, and by now I had learned to trust her instincts more than my own optimism. Around noon, I was stacking the last of the firewood when I heard the sound of tires crunching gravel. Not slow or cautious like someone taking a wrong turn, but purposeful and direct. I looked up and saw a beige crossover SUV come into view. One of those bland, government-issue-looking cars that always seem to belong to someone who thinks a laminated name tag gives them authority. The vehicle stopped just a few feet from the cabin. The driver's door opened, and out stepped a woman I would later come to know far too well. She was maybe in her early 60s, dressed in beige slacks and a crisp polo shirt with the kind of posture that screamed self-importance. Her graying hair was pulled tightly into a ponytail. Her face was pinched, lips set in a line that probably hadn't smiled in a decade. She carried a large clipboard under one arm, clutched tight against her chest like a weapon. "Hello," she called out, loud and clear, as if making an announcement to a crowd. "I'm Karen Withers. I represent the Homeowners Oversight Association for this district." I blinked. That was the first I'd heard of any formal name for what Hank had vaguely mentioned. Oversight Association? We hadn't received a single packet, welcome letter, or email about such a thing. I looked over my shoulder, hoping Alyssa had heard the voice. And of course she had. She stepped onto the porch a second later, her eyes already narrowed slightly, her arms crossed. Karen took a few steps closer but stayed on the gravel, her eyes scanning the cabin with practiced judgment. "I'm here to perform a routine compliance inspection," she said. "All new property owners are subject to it, as per the guidelines outlined in the community handbook." I stepped down from the porch slowly. "We haven't received any handbook. No mention of an HOA in the sale paperwork, and the realtor said nothing about a governing board. We're not aware of any mandatory inspections." Karen gave a short, clipped nod, as if that confirmed something for her rather than disputed it. She adjusted her grip on the clipboard. "That's not unusual," she said. "The realtors in this area tend to be careless. Regardless, I'm here now and need to document the property. It won't take long." She took a step forward, and that was when Alyssa descended the porch. Calm but firm. Her tone was low, even, but I recognized the one-word warning in it. "No." Karen stopped. She blinked at Alyssa, as if she hadn't registered the word, or perhaps wasn't used to hearing it. "I'm sorry," she said. I said no. You're not coming onto our property. We don't recognize the authority of any HOA, and we've received nothing in writing that outlines your jurisdiction. Until we get something official, you're trespassing. Karen stiffened. She glanced back at me, then again at Alyssa, sizing her up in a new way now, perhaps seeing the square shoulders, the sure footing. Karen smiled then, but it was thin and brittle, like glass over a flame. I think you'll find that refusal to cooperate can carry penalties, she said. I've had to file reports before. Once I begin the process, it's hard to undo. Alyssa didn't blink. Then you'll need to begin whatever process you believe you're entitled to. Just know that the moment you step 1 foot onto this property without our consent, you're violating state trespass laws. Karen held her ground for a few seconds longer, then let out a short laugh. It was humorless, dry, and empty. You people always think you're special, she said, shaking her head. You come out here thinking you can do whatever you want. But there are rules. There are standards. She turned and walked back to her car. No further threats, no dramatic flurry of papers or tantrum, just a stiff, deliberate retreat. She started the engine and drove away without looking back. Alyssa watched the SUV disappear down the gravel road and then exhaled through her nose. She turned to me with a shrug. Well, that's her, she said. I nodded. Karen. She smiled faintly. Textbook, authoritarian personality, no real power, so she creates it. Later, we looked through the sale documents again, checking every page, every clause. There was nothing. No governing body, no fee structure, no mention of any association with the power to regulate or inspect. Alyssa did some digging online, too. A few posts on obscure local forums mentioned a Karen who harassed new property owners, often calling herself the head of the HOA. It was never clear whether she had any legal claim to that title. Most said they just ignored her. One commenter described her as a walking fine print, always showing up unannounced, citing vague regulations, and threatening citations that never arrived. Another post claimed she had a compliance logbook where she recorded who cooperated and who did not. Alyssa rolled her eyes at that. Still, the consensus was clear. She was relentless. That night, as we sat inside with the fire crackling, I could tell Alyssa wasn't relaxed. She didn't say much, but I could feel the tension in her. Her shoulders were tight again. Her eyes kept flicking toward the window, listening, watching. I wanted to say something reassuring, to joke about how every neighborhood has a nosy neighbor, but I knew better than to downplay it. Alyssa didn't get spooked easily. She could shrug off most things that would put someone else on edge. If this woman had already made her wary, it meant something. Outside, the wind picked up again. The trees swayed, their branches scratching against each other like they were whispering warnings. I thought about the footprints, about the way Karen had arrived so quickly after we discovered them, about the way she had assumed authority without offering any proof. It was only day 4. The peace we had come here for was already unraveling, and something told me the worst was still ahead. 2 days passed without incident. We tried to ease back into the rhythm we had hoped to establish, lighting the fire pit each night and walking by the lake each morning. Alyssa resumed her hikes. I returned to my notebook and made a half-hearted attempt at writing again. But beneath the surface of everything we did lingered a tension we could not name. It hung between us in the silence and surfaced in the way we locked the doors twice before bed, or in the way Alyssa checked the trailhead before starting her morning walk. We had told ourselves Karen had made her point and driven off, that she had seen she would get no cooperation here and had moved on to someone else. We wanted to believe that, but we both knew better. The first time we saw her again, it was from the porch. I had just come out to take a call from my brother, who wanted to check in on how the cabin was treating us. I wandered toward the edge of the lot, phone to my ear, when I caught a flicker of motion out by the tree line. Something light-colored moved behind the brush. I narrowed my eyes and stepped down into the dirt to get a better angle. It was distant, maybe 50 yards out, but it was her. She was wearing a cream-colored windbreaker and holding that same clipboard. She stood behind a birch tree, not moving. I watched her for nearly 30 seconds before she seemed to notice me watching her. She did not wave. She did not speak. She simply turned and disappeared into the woods. I told Alyssa about it that evening. She listened, arms folded, and then went outside to do her own check. The tracks were faint but there, healed footprints, pressed into the leaf litter and looping around the edge of our land. Alyssa crouched, studying them, and gave a sharp nod to herself. She did not say much that night, but the next day she set up a trail camera. She mounted it discreetly on a pine tree, camouflaged in bark-like casing, angled toward the area where I had seen Karen. Then she set up another facing the gravel drive. I asked if she really thought Karen would come back, if it was worth the trouble. Alyssa did not answer right away. When she finally did, she spoke softly but with that firm, certain edge I knew so well. People like her test limits. Once, then again, then they stop asking permission. The words stuck with me. Later that afternoon, I was splitting kindling behind the shed when I heard footsteps on the gravel. I assumed it was Alyssa, but when I turned, it was not. Karen stood by the edge of the driveway again. She wore the same windbreaker, but now she also had a canvas shoulder bag, and this time she did not smile or introduce herself. She stood with the bag clutched to her chest and looked at the cabin like it had personally offended her. "I saw non-conforming paint trim on the rear dormer," she said without preamble. "That violates appearance regulations. I need to photograph it for documentation." I let the axe hang loosely by my side. I did not respond immediately. There was something different in her posture now. The false civility from before had given way to something colder, more entrenched. She had made a decision. She had decided this was her mission, and she would not be denied. "We're not part of your association," I said, keeping my voice even. "You have no authority here. You can't take pictures of private property for a group we never agreed to join." She narrowed her eyes. "Refusal to comply will result in citations. The board meets monthly. Non-compliance will be reviewed, and enforcement actions can be taken." I stepped forward, carefully placing myself between her and the cabin. I wanted to believe I could reason with her, that if I said the right thing, she would back off. But there was a hardness in her eyes, something steely and immovable. "You need to leave," I said. "Right now." She stood for a beat longer than was comfortable, then gave me a final glare and walked away. She did not run. She did not sneak. She walked slowly, deliberately, as if making sure I understood she was not done with us. That night, Alyssa pulled the SD card from the trail camera and loaded it onto her laptop. She sat at the small dining table under the window while I watched from the couch. At first, the images were what we expected. Animals mostly. A raccoon, a deer or two, a squirrel that seemed particularly fond of climbing the post over and over again. Then the timestamp hit 2 in the morning, and there she was. Karen stood at the edge of the frame in a hooded jacket, barely lit by the moonlight. She was holding something in her hand. It looked like a flashlight, but the beam was pointed downward. She turned in a slow circle, scanning the ground. Then she looked directly at the camera. Her eyes glinted in the infrared light, and for a moment, she did not look like a woman lost in the woods or making a mistake. She looked like someone who had done this before. Alyssa leaned back in her chair. She looked at me but said nothing for a long moment. Then she closed the laptop and stood. "I'm going to town tomorrow," she said. "I want to talk to the sheriff." The next morning, she drove down the mountain road while I stayed behind. I tried to write again, but the words would not come. I kept thinking about Karen standing out there in the dark, alone, walking our property like she had a key to it. I knew then that this was not just a matter of enforcing phony rules. This was about control. Karen had appointed herself as gatekeeper of the mountain. And people like that did not just stop when told no. They came back. They always came back. When Alyssa returned that afternoon, she was quiet. She placed her phone and keys on the counter and poured herself a glass of water. "Well," she said, "the sheriff knows her. Said she has a reputation. No formal complaints, just rumors. People don't want to get involved. Said she makes life hard for anyone who crosses her, so most folks just try to avoid attention. And now? Now they have something more than rumors." That night, we sat in silence as the wind blew through the trees again. The peace we had come to find was gone, replaced with something else, something watchful, something that waited just beyond the edge of the firelight. The envelope was taped to our front door. We found it the next morning, after a long and restless night broken by the occasional sound of shifting trees and a single, unexplained clatter against the porch railing that neither of us dared investigate at the time. I opened the door expecting the usual creak of wood and the smell of pine, but instead, I found a letter in a manila envelope slapped over the middle of the door like a warning sign. No postage, no address. No name on it except a scrawled notice of violation, written in all caps with a red pen. Alyssa stepped up behind me, silent, her eyes narrowing as she looked over my shoulder. I pulled it down slowly and handed it to her. She did not open it right away. She just studied the handwriting, then the envelope itself, then turned it over and examined the seam where it had been folded and sealed. We sat down inside at the kitchen table, and she peeled it open like it might contain something dangerous. The paper inside was thick, printed on what looked like office stationery, but the content was what really made us pause. Dear property owner, according to Article 6 of the Residential Standards and Appearance Policy, your property has failed to meet the acceptable visual condition for continued occupancy. Multiple violations have been noted, including improper paint trim, storage of unapproved outdoor equipment, and failure to register landscaping modifications. A compliance officer will arrive on site within 48 hours to conduct a follow-up inspection. If violations are not corrected or access is denied, a penalty of $500 per day may be assessed. Signed, Karen Withers, Director of Enforcement, Clearwater Ridge Homeowners Oversight Association. There was no official header, no signature line, no legal language, not even a phone number or return address. Just Karen's name typed at the bottom like it meant something. Alyssa placed the letter flat on the table and sat back. Her eyes were steady, and her mouth formed a tight, unreadable line. This is a fake, she said. She typed this up on her own printer. There is no legal association registered in the county records under that name. She reached for her laptop and pulled up the files she had downloaded from the county clerk's office the day before. She searched again to be sure, but nothing changed. No homeowners organization was associated with our lot. No bylaws had been filed. The property was zoned for private residential use and was subject to state building codes and forest regulations, but no additional governing bodies had jurisdiction here. I felt anger starting to build in my chest. She had come to our home in the middle of the night. She had snooped around in the dark and now left a phony threat taped to our front door. She was no longer just annoying or eccentric. This was targeted, deliberate, and creeping into something far worse than neighborly interference. I think she's pushing to provoke us, I said. She wants us to react so she can escalate it and try to make us the problem. Alyssa nodded slowly. She picked up the letter again, then folded it and slid it into a plastic evidence sleeve from the bag she kept in her go-bag. She had brought it more out of habit than expectation, but it was clear now that instinct had served her well. Let her provoke, she said. If she shows up again, we document everything, every word, every move. The moment she crosses the line, I'll stop her myself. I knew she meant it. That afternoon, Alyssa installed a second trail camera, this one mounted discreetly above the door, just beneath the overhang where the envelope had been taped. The other camera still recorded the driveway, and she checked its footage again while I made lunch. Sure enough, at 4:18 a.m., the familiar silhouette of Karen appeared in the frame. She stepped lightly, avoiding the center of the gravel, almost gliding as she approached. She stopped at the porch steps, looked left and right, then reached into her bag and pulled out the envelope. The camera captured her clearly this time. Her face, her clothes, the name stitched in small letters on her jacket, Withers. We sat and watched the clip twice. Alyssa saved it, backed it up, and transferred a copy to a cloud account. She doesn't realize yet, she said, but she just handed us everything. It was not until later that evening, as we were cleaning up after dinner, that we saw her again. She had parked her SUV just around the bend of the road, partially hidden behind a cluster of trees. It was Alyssa who spotted her through the kitchen window. She was standing by the back quarter panel, clipboard in hand again, staring directly at the house. We both went still. Then Alyssa walked calmly to the front door and stepped outside without a word. Karen saw her and immediately turned to face her, holding the clipboard like a shield. "I'm here for the inspection," she said before Alyssa could say a thing. "You've already been notified." Alyssa stood at the edge of the porch, arms relaxed at her sides. Her voice was calm, practiced, deliberate. "There is no authorized inspection. You are not part of any recognized enforcement body. You have delivered a fraudulent notice, trespassed multiple times, and have now returned without consent. I am ordering you to leave this property immediately." Karen's lips pressed into a firm line. She did not move. "You're obstructing an authorized compliance officer," she said. "I'm going to make a note of this. You'll be fined accordingly." She lifted the clipboard and began scribbling something down. Alyssa stepped off the porch and walked forward. Her badge was not visible, and she had not yet identified herself. She stopped several feet short of Karen. "Turn around," she said. Karen looked up. "What?" "You're on private property. You've been warned repeatedly. Turn around and leave or face criminal trespass charges." Karen's pen paused. "I don't respond to threats," she said. Alyssa smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. "Neither do I." Karen hesitated, then snapped the pen into the clipboard and walked back to her SUV. She did not speak again. She got in, started the engine, and drove away. Alyssa waited until she was gone, then pulled out her phone and called the sheriff's department. She gave them the full summary, now with proof to support every claim. The officer on duty promised to file a report and follow up in the morning. Later, as the night settled in and the fire flickered in the hearth, I sat beside Alyssa on the couch. She still had the fake violation notice on the coffee table in its evidence sleeve. "Do you think she's really dangerous?" I asked. Alyssa thought about it. "Not yet," she said. "But she's desperate to prove she has power. That makes her unpredictable. The moment she realizes we're not afraid of her, she'll either double down or break." We both looked out the window then. The woods were dark, the trees unmoving in the still air, but we both felt it. This wasn't over. It was only beginning. The trap was not elaborate. It did not need to be. It only needed to be patient and obvious in just the right way. Alyssa had set dozens of them in her line of work, each tailored to the suspect, each designed to press on the weak points in someone's behavior until they cracked under the weight of their own habits. Karen, for all her posturing and faux authority, was predictable. She had already shown us that she could not help herself. She wanted control. She needed to be seen as important. The more we ignored her, the more aggressive she became. The trick was giving her exactly the opportunity she thought she needed. We started by making it look like we were leaving for the day. Early in the morning, just after dawn, I packed a few bags and tossed them into the back of the SUV. Alyssa followed behind, double-checking the front door and windows in full view of the driveway camera. We pulled out and drove up the gravel road at a leisurely pace, just like we had done a few times before when heading into town. But instead of driving all the way to the gas station or the general store, we circled back along a fire service road and parked out of sight behind a ridge about a quarter-mile away. From there, Alyssa hiked quietly through the woods and returned to the cabin alone. She entered from the back, careful not to leave tracks in the dirt where the trail camera would catch them. Once inside, she stationed herself by the front window with a clear view of the porch and driveway. She set her phone to record, placed a second small camera just behind the curtain, and waited. The blinds remained partially open to suggest the house was empty. The television was off. The lights were off. Everything signaled that the cabin was unoccupied. I remained on the ridge with a pair of binoculars and a radio. My job was simple: keep watch on the approach, call her the moment anything moved. It was nearly noon before the familiar beige SUV returned. The vehicle slowed as it rounded the bend and came to a full stop just beyond the edge of the driveway. Karen did not get out right away. She sat behind the wheel for several minutes. I imagined her scanning the cabin for signs of life, perhaps rehearsing whatever justification she had decided on this time. Maybe she told herself she was doing the neighborhood a favor. Maybe she genuinely believed the lies she printed in her phony letters. Whatever story she clung to, it did not matter anymore. Eventually, the driver's door opened and she stepped out. She wore the same windbreaker and carried her ever-present clipboard, but this time she also carried a small black satchel slung over one shoulder. She moved with confidence, not like someone creeping or sneaking, but with the steady, entitled pace of someone convinced that their presence could not be questioned. That made sense. No one had ever caught her before. Not like this. She approached the porch slowly, taking notes on her clipboard as she walked. She paused by the front steps and looked down at something. I later learned it was a bag of soil I had intentionally left out of place. Harmless, but just messy enough to be labeled non-compliant by someone inventing rules. She climbed the steps and stood in front of the door. Alyssa told me later that her pulse barely changed. She waited for Karen to knock. She never did. Instead, Karen pulled a ring of keys from her satchel. Alyssa was ready for that. I heard her voice clearly through the radio, low and calm. She is attempting forced entry. Karen inserted one of the keys and tried to turn it. It did not work, of course. Then she pulled out another, smaller key and tried again. Still no luck. She reached into her bag again, and this time pulled out a small tool, a lockpick set. That was the line. Alyssa stood up from behind the curtain and moved to the door in 3 quiet steps. She opened it before Karen could react and stepped onto the porch. Karen spun around, startled but trying to cover it with a frown. "You're home," she said, voice too bright, eyes too sharp. "I'm here for the inspection. I didn't realize you were inside." Alyssa said nothing at first. She took a step forward, positioning herself between Karen and the door. "You were trying to open the door," she said evenly. Karen gave a small laugh, clearly rehearsed. "I was checking to see if the lock was functioning. We've had some break-ins in the area. I'm authorized to perform safety checks. You were issued a warning." Alyssa reached into her pocket and produced her badge. She held it out at eye level, steady and unmistakable. "I am Alyssa Harper, Federal Law Enforcement. You are not authorized to perform safety checks. You are not part of any legally recognized homeowners association. You have been advised of this more than once." Karen stared at the badge, her mouth parting slightly. For a second she did not speak. Then she drew herself up and tried to recover her tone. "You're threatening me," she said. "You can't do that. I'm a compliance officer. I'm following protocol." Alyssa did not move. Her voice remained calm. "You are trespassing on private property. You attempted unlawful entry with a tool designed to bypass a lock. You have falsely represented yourself as an official and have issued fraudulent documents under a fabricated organization. You are now being detained, pending arrival of local authorities." Karen blinked. "You can't detain me." Alyssa stepped closer. "I can, and I am." Karen turned to leave, but Alyssa moved faster. She stepped behind her, produced a set of handcuffs from her back pocket, and within seconds had secured Karen's wrists. The whole thing took less than 10 seconds. Karen gasped as the metal clicked closed. "This is illegal," she hissed. "You're making a huge mistake." "You made the mistake," Alyssa said. "I came down from the ridge a few minutes later and saw Karen seated on the porch bench, hands cuffed in front of her. She refused to look at me. Alyssa stood nearby, speaking to the county sheriff on the phone. She described everything in detail, including the security footage, the documents, and the tools Karen had carried. When the sheriff's deputy arrived 20 minutes later, he took one look at Karen and sighed. He recognized her. That was clear. He did not ask many questions. He just nodded as Alyssa explained what had happened, accepted the evidence bag with the lockpick set, and finally turned to Karen with a weariness that spoke of long familiarity. "Karen," he said, "we've talked about this." Karen did not respond. The deputy read her rights and led her down to his patrol car. She climbed in without resisting, though her face was red and her jaw clenched tight. After they drove off, Alyssa turned to me. She looked tired, not from the confrontation, but from the build-up to it, the tension of being watched, prodded, tested. She rubbed her temples and let out a breath. "I came here to relax," she said. I nodded. "Next time we'll pick a cabin without a local dictator." She chuckled softly, then leaned into my side. We both knew this was not the end. Not yet. But for the first time in a week, the mountain was quiet. It was strange how quickly the quiet returned. After Karen had been taken away by the sheriff's deputy, there was a moment that felt like exhaling after holding your breath too long. Alyssa and I stood in the driveway for a while, watching the dust settle behind the patrol car as it wound down the mountain. The only sound was the wind in the pines and the distant call of a hawk. It felt almost like the woods were recognizing what had happened and reclaiming their space, pushing back against the tension that had built like a storm cloud over our property. We walked back inside, not speaking much. There was no celebration, no high fives or jokes about justice, just a long silence filled with a kind of cautious relief. Alyssa went straight to her laptop and began organizing the files, video footage, photographs, The letter Karen had posted to the door, even the audio clip from the moment she attempted to unlock the door. She catalogued everything with a precision that reminded me of the reports she used to write at the end of a long case. I left her to it and went to sit on the porch, needing the air. By the time she joined me, the sun had started to dip behind the western ridge, throwing long golden streaks across the lake. She sat down in the chair beside mine and handed me a cup of coffee. "I spoke to the sheriff again," she said after a few sips. "He confirmed that Karen's facing at least 2 misdemeanors, possibly more depending on what the county attorney decides. Unlawful entry, criminal impersonation, trespassing, maybe harassment if the other neighbors come forward." I looked at her. "Do you think they will?" She shrugged. "Hard to say. People like Karen operate in the spaces where people stay silent. It's easier for most folks to keep their heads down than to start something. But sometimes all it takes is one person standing up to open the door for others." There was a long pause. "Do you think she'll be back?" I asked. Alyssa did not answer right away. She took a slow breath, watching a pair of birds flit through the trees across the lake. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm, but edged with caution. "If she posts bail and gets out before formal charges stick, yes, I think she'll come back. Not tonight, maybe not even this week, but people like her don't let go of a grudge. Not unless they are forced to." We left the lights off that night and kept the windows open. There was a new stillness to the place. Not the nervous kind from before, when we were always waiting to hear a twig snap or catch a flicker of movement. This quiet felt earned. We went to bed early, both of us exhausted from a week of watching, waiting, preparing. For the first time in days, I slept deeply and without dreaming. The next morning, we woke to an email. It came from a private account we did not recognize. The subject line was short and unassuming. "HOA complaint review." Alyssa opened it with a slow exhale. Inside, there was no message, only a scanned PDF. Another fake violation letter, nearly identical to the one Karen had taped to our door, but this time it had a different letterhead. It read, "Clearwater Property Oversight Committee," which was not what she had called it last time. Alyssa stared at it for a few seconds, then smirked. "She's improvising now," she said. "She must have sent this before they processed her intake." I leaned over and read it myself. This one accused us of hostile obstruction of oversight responsibilities and warned of permanent blacklisting from community events. I chuckled. "Well, I guess we're not getting invited to the non-existent summer picnic." Alyssa forwarded the email to the sheriff's office and added it to her folder of evidence. She also sent it to the state licensing board for legal clerks and property managers, just in case Karen had any professional credentials left to lose. Later that day, the deputy returned to the cabin to ask a few follow-up questions. He was polite but clearly embarrassed, like someone forced to clean up a mess they had warned about but were powerless to prevent. He confirmed that Karen had posted bail within hours of being booked. No surprise. Her record was technically clean until now, and she had probably never imagined her behavior would result in anything more than a few harsh words or a warning. "She's already called the department twice," the deputy told us. "Claims you set her up, said she was conducting official duties and you entrapped her." Alyssa raised an eyebrow. "Did she mention the lockpick?" He nodded. Didn't deny it. Just said she was checking for a maintenance issue and believed the home was unsecured. Said she had verbal permission from a former occupant. "That's a new one," I said. "She's grasping now," the deputy replied. "We're preparing the case for the prosecutor. Your footage makes this open and shut. I doubt we'll hear much more from her, unless she decides to double down. If she does, call us." After he left, Alyssa paced the cabin for a bit, restless energy moving through her in waves. I knew that feeling. Even though the danger had passed, part of her was still stuck in alert mode. She was trained to remain ready long after the threat had gone. It took her a while to shift out of it. I cooked a simple dinner that night: grilled vegetables, cold pasta, and a bottle of wine we had saved for when we felt safe again. We ate on the porch as the sun dipped low, the sky turning a deep pink as clouds rolled lazily overhead. For the first time, we allowed ourselves to feel something close to comfort. A few of the other cabins in the distance lit their porch lights. It was the first time I noticed how many of them had stayed dark the whole week. Maybe people had been gone. Maybe they had simply learned to keep their lights off when Karen was active. But now, there was a shift. like someone had turned the volume back up on a record that had been paused too long. That night, Alyssa told me about a case from years ago. A fraud investigator in a small town who had convinced dozens of people to invest in a fake community improvement program. He had printed pamphlets, held public meetings, wore a name badge he made at home. Nobody questioned him until someone realized he never actually worked for the town. It took months to unravel the damage, but eventually, he was caught and prosecuted. Karen reminds me of him, Alyssa said, except she skipped the con and went straight to control. I asked her what made someone like that tick. What pushed someone to fake authority just to feel important? Fear, she said, and ego. They're afraid of being ignored, of being nobody, so they invent something, and when it works, they believe it's real. Even when it falls apart, they tell themselves it was everyone else who failed to understand. We sat in silence for a while. She's not done yet, Alyssa added, but now she's on our timeline, not hers. I looked out at the still lake, the moon beginning to rise over the ridge. For the first time since we arrived, I believed her. 2 days passed without a single sound from Karen. The quiet felt deceptive, like the stillness that comes just before a storm rolls over the ridge. Alyssa said little during those 2 days, but I could tell her mind was constantly spinning. She was building timelines, replaying Karen's behavior, checking our trail cams like clockwork, and making careful notes. She filed another update with the sheriff's office and received confirmation that the case had moved to the county attorney for review. On paper, it looked like progress, but we both knew paper could not stop a person like Karen if they had not yet decided to give up. It was on the third morning that everything began to unravel, and not in the way we expected. We were walking along the trail just north of our cabin, following a wide path lined with moss-covered stones and patches of ferns. The air was cool and smelled of damp leaves and pine. It should have been peaceful. We had started the hike to break the mental loop, to shake off the tension. Alyssa had her water bottle strapped to her backpack and her sleeves rolled up. She was finally looking more relaxed, or at least she had been, until the sound of raised voices drifted through the trees. We stopped at the same time, both turning toward the direction of the sound. It came from down the slope, maybe 100 yards off the trail, muffled by distance but unmistakable. A woman was shouting, and a man was trying to answer her, though his voice was harder to make out. Alyssa moved first, quietly but with purpose. We stepped off the trail, descending through brush and under low-hanging branches until we came to a clearing behind a narrow cabin we had never seen before. It was tucked into a bend in the hill, hidden from the road by a ring of pines. The front door stood open. A woman, not Karen, stood just outside it with her arms folded tightly across her chest. She was younger, maybe in her 30s, and her face was flushed with frustration. Across from her stood an older man, perhaps in his 60s, wearing a ball cap and holding a small potted plant. They were not arguing with each other. They were arguing with Karen. She stood near the corner of the cabin, clipboard clutched in both hands, her jaw set in a hard line. "You can't put that there," Karen said, her voice clear and sharp. "It's within the setback zone. It violates the sightline code." The woman took a step forward. "There is no code. You don't have any authority here. We've already spoken to the sheriff." Karen didn't flinch. She scribbled something on her clipboard and then pointed toward a gravel patch beside the cabin. "That swing set is also unapproved. You were notified last season. I gave you the benefit of the doubt, but now it's clear you're ignoring compliance standards." The man raised his voice now. "You showed up here at 6 in the morning, Karen. You walked into our backyard while our daughter was eating breakfast. Do you understand how insane that is?" Karen replied with silence, then wrote again on the clipboard. She appeared completely undeterred, as though their words were bouncing off some invisible wall she had built around herself. Alyssa stepped out from the trees then. She moved slowly but deliberately, enough to catch Karen's attention. The others saw her too, and the woman's expression shifted from anger to cautious relief. She recognized Alyssa from the arrest. Karen's eyes narrowed. "You've got no business here," she said. Alyssa kept her tone even. "I'm not here to interfere. I'm just here to observe. These folks can speak for themselves." Karen turned her full attention on Alyssa now. The clipboard lowered slightly, and her face hardened in a way that made the lines around her eyes deepen. "You think you've won something," she said. "You think putting on a show for the sheriff makes you some kind of hero. But you don't understand this community. You don't understand what it takes to keep order. Without people like me, this place falls apart. Alyssa tilted her head, studying Karen the way someone studies a pattern in glass before it breaks. You're not keeping order, she replied. You're keeping control, and there's a difference. Karen shook her head and turned back to the other couple. She started to speak again, but this time the woman stepped forward and held up her phone. I've recorded everything, she said, including the part where you walked around our house uninvited and took pictures of our kitchen through the window. If you come back here again, I'll file my own report. Karen's mouth opened as if to respond, but no words came. She stood there for a few seconds, gripping the clipboard tight, and then turned and walked down the slope toward the road. She moved with that same rigid posture she always had, but there was something in her step that felt a little less certain. We stayed behind and spoke with the couple for a while. Their names were Rachel and Marcus, and they had bought their cabin nearly 5 years ago. According to them, Karen had been a nuisance since their second month of ownership, showing up unannounced and citing fictitious infractions. At first they had tried to reason with her, then they ignored her. But she only became more persistent over time. She used to be subtle, Rachel said. Now she just barges in like she has a badge. Last week she threatened to report us to Child Protective Services because we let our daughter play in the yard barefoot. Alyssa promised to connect them with the county's legal aid office and encouraged them to submit a formal complaint. Marcus agreed and asked if Alyssa would share the footage from the arrest. He wanted others to see it, to understand what Karen had become. On the walk back to our cabin, neither of us said much. The sun was higher now, and the woods were brighter, but I could feel the heaviness in Alyssa's steps. She had seen this kind of escalation before. People in power, or those pretending to have it, rarely stopped of their own accord. They had to be exposed. Sometimes they had to be removed. But before that could happen, they often lashed out. We both knew Karen's behavior was not winding down. It was climbing towards something. That evening, we found another email. This one was sent to several people in the area, including us. It was a long rant, typed in the same font Karen had used before, accusing Alyssa of impersonating law enforcement and claiming a conspiracy against the oversight infrastructure of Clearwater Ridge. The language was jumbled, dramatic, and dripping with paranoia. There was even a line that read, "Her badge was counterfeit. I intend to pursue criminal charges against the imposter and her accomplice." Alyssa read it without flinching. "She's spiraling," she said. I looked at her. "Does she scare you?" Alyssa thought for a moment, then shook her head. "Not yet." She closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. "But she's getting there." The day Karen was officially charged, a quiet ripple passed through the mountain. It was not loud or dramatic. There were no patrol cars tearing up gravel roads or news vans parked outside our cabin. Just a slow movement, like something old shifting in the soil. Alyssa and I found out about it not from the sheriff's office, but from Hank. He showed up just after breakfast, walking up the drive with a plastic bag of peaches from his tree and a look that was both tired and strangely satisfied. I met him halfway and took the bag, then waved for him to come sit on the porch. "Got something for you," he said as he eased into a chair. "Appreciate it," I said, holding up the bag. "No, I mean news, but the peaches are good too." Alyssa stepped outside with 2 mugs of coffee and handed one to Hank. She sat without speaking. He gave her a respectful nod, then cleared his throat. "Karen Withers was charged this morning. They made it official down at the county courthouse. Trespassing, falsifying official documents, and something about impersonating a municipal officer. Judge signed off on it about an hour ago." I glanced at Alyssa. She sipped her coffee, showing no emotion, but I could tell she already knew. She had been checking the court logs since the arrest, tracking the filings like clockwork. Still, hearing it spoken aloud changed something in the air. "She going to fight it?" Alyssa asked. Hank chuckled softly. "Of course she is. Claimed the sheriff has a personal grudge, that the charges are politically motivated, that you," he nodded toward Alyssa, "are part of some federal cover-up meant to dismantle rural order. Whole mess of nonsense." "She emailed that to people last week," I said. "I got it," Hank replied, "along with 6 other cabins, but nobody's buying it. Not anymore." He leaned forward slightly, his tone shifting. You might not see it yet, but things are changing. Folks have been putting up with Karen for years because nobody wanted to be the one to start something. People just wanted peace and figured if they kept their heads down, she'd eventually get bored. She never did. He paused, tapping a finger against his cup. But now, she got caught. Not just stopped. Caught. Handcuffs. Badge. Witnesses. Proof. People saw it. That matters. We sat there for a while, sipping coffee and watching the lake shimmer beneath the sun. Hank told us a few more stories, things Karen had done over the years, letters she sent threatening fines that never existed, a family she pressured into moving after accusing them of violating fire code with their garden hose. Once, she filed a noise complaint against a deaf couple for playing music too loud at a birthday gathering they did not even host. The pattern was always the same: assert control, claim rules no one had ever heard of, threaten consequences just vague enough to scare the quiet ones. But now, Hank said, the quiet ones are starting to speak. That afternoon, Alyssa and I drove into town, not for groceries or errands, but to attend the open forum at the community center. The sheriff had invited locals to bring their concerns and share any information relevant to the ongoing case against Karen. We were not sure what to expect. We walked in and found 24 people already seated, some familiar faces, some strangers. The room smelled like pine cleaner and old carpet. At the front sat Deputy Reynolds and a clerk from the county office. When Alyssa and I took seats near the back, heads turned. A few people nodded. One woman, the same woman from the cabin we had found Karen harassing, walked over and thanked Alyssa quietly. "I'm not the only one," she whispered. "There are a lot of us." And she was right. One by one, people stood up and shared their stories. A man described how Karen had come onto his porch and taken photos of his barbecue grill, then claimed it violated environmental discharge ordinances. A couple recounted how she followed them in her car one evening after dark, taking pictures as they drove up the hill. One man said she had written him 3 separate notices for his window shutters, each with a different infraction listed. All of them were forged. All of them had been signed with that same name at the bottom: Karen Withers, Director of Enforcement. Alyssa sat still through it all, taking mental notes, nodding occasionally. When she was finally asked to speak, she stood and gave a brief but clear statement. She described the events of the arrest, confirmed her identity as a federal officer, and outlined the evidence collected from our property. She kept her tone professional and never once spoke in anger. But her message was unmistakable. The rules Karen invented were just that: fiction. The authority she claimed was never hers. And now, finally, someone had stopped her. After the forum, a few people came up to speak with Alyssa in private. One man offered to testify. Another handed over a folder of old emails and letters he had kept for years but never shown anyone. There was a shared energy in the room, quiet but undeniable, a sense that something long stuck had finally started to move. We returned to the cabin that evening with a strange mix of weariness and momentum. Alyssa downloaded several statements she had received and organized them by date. I prepared dinner while she worked, trying not to disturb her focus. As the light faded and the trees outside darkened, the atmosphere in the cabin began to feel different. Not just safer, but lighter, less watched, less tense, as if the shadows that had been circling the edge of the woods had finally backed away. The following morning, Alyssa received an email from the county attorney's office. They were formally requesting her assistance in organizing the timeline of Karen's behavior. Her arrest had triggered an avalanche. With multiple statements and recordings now submitted, the case was building into something much larger than one unlawful entry. The charges might expand, the sentence might increase, and Karen, for all her arrogance, would have to face the people she had been trying to dominate for years. Still, the cabin was not without reminders. We found a deep footprint near the porch 2 days later, sunken into soft earth from the rain. It was not fresh, probably left before the storm, but it was angled toward the window. Alyssa examined it, then took a photo without saying much. Later, we sat together on the porch, watching clouds roll across the lake. "She's not done fighting," Alyssa said, "but she's losing ground. She's already lost the one thing that gave her power: fear." I looked out at the trees and thought of how quiet they had been lately. The birds were louder, the wind was softer, and for the first time in weeks, I could sit without glancing over my shoulder every few minutes. Karen had stirred up a storm she could no longer contain, and as the community began to speak, it was no longer our burden alone. The mountain was reclaiming its peace, one voice at a time. By the start of the second week, the cabin had begun to feel like ours again. The scent of pine and smoke replaced the stale undercurrent of tension that had clung to the place since Karen first appeared. The air felt cleaner. The trees, once watching silently from the edge of the clearing, now stood as quiet witnesses to the changes unfolding around them. Even the lake looked brighter. Its surface reflected the sky with a kind of ease, as though the water itself had been waiting for something to be set right. Alyssa moved through the cabin differently now. She still checked the cameras each morning and continued to organize her notes for the county attorney's office. But there was a rhythm in her steps that had not been there before. She had always been composed, always sure of herself, but now she moved like someone who had cleared a room of noise and could finally hear her own thoughts again. It was subtle, but I noticed. We spent more time outside, afternoons on the porch, mornings by the lake. We repaired a loose board on the deck and repainted the trim Karen had once claimed was a violation. Not because it needed to be done, but because we wanted to claim it for ourselves, to strip it of the weight she had tried to place on it. Each brushstroke felt like reclaiming something she had tried to take. One morning, while Alyssa was fishing near the rocks, I took a walk down to Hank's place. His cabin sat lower on the ridge, with a small vegetable garden and a wide wooden swing tied to an old oak tree. He waved me over before I could even knock. "She around?" he asked, meaning Alyssa. "Down by the water. I told her to catch dinner." He laughed and offered me a cold drink. We sat under the shade of the porch while he cleaned a pile of green beans with a small knife. "You know," he said, after a few minutes of quiet, "you two did something a lot of people around here were too afraid to try. And I don't mean just filing a report. You looked her in the eye. That counts for more than most people realize." "I think she was counting on silence," I said. "Counting on everyone being too polite to push back." Hank nodded. "That's how it always starts. A warning here, a letter there. You think, no big deal, just let it slide. But then one day you wake up and she's walking your property like it belongs to her." He sighed and leaned back in his chair. "Feels like the first real summer in a while. People are starting to talk to each other again. Had 3 neighbors stop by yesterday just to say hello. That hasn't happened in years." Later that day, we decided to host a cookout. It was Alyssa's idea, though she made it sound like a casual thought. We were sitting by the lake, watching the sun sink low across the water, and she said, maybe it's time people started using this place again, not just hiding out in it. We passed out handwritten invitations to the neighbors we knew, and left a few tucked under porch railings for the ones we had yet to meet. No pressure. Just food, conversation, and a reminder that the ridge belonged to all of us, not just the loudest voice with a clipboard. When the day came, people trickled in slowly. Hank arrived first, carrying a basket of cornbread and a jug of sweet tea. Then Rachel and Marcus, who brought their daughter and a big dish of macaroni salad. One by one, others followed. Some we had spoken to already, others we had only glimpsed from afar. It was the first time many of them had stood on the same patch of grass, trading stories, shaking hands, and laughing under the wide sky. Alyssa stood mostly to the side, flipping burgers and smiling politely as people came up to thank her. She accepted their gratitude with grace, but never let it linger too long. She was never one to bask in praise. She had done what needed to be done, and now she wanted everyone else to have the space to move forward. As the sun set and lanterns lit up the edges of the yard, music played from a small speaker, and the sound of children chasing each other rang through the trees. The woods, once filled with the weight of unspoken fear, now echoed with the sounds of a community waking up. People talked about repairs they were planning, trails they wanted to clear, even the possibility of a proper shared garden. One woman mentioned organizing a real neighborhood council, one that operated on transparency and choice, not control and intimidation. Alyssa listened, nodded, and then quietly excused herself to go check the grill. I found her later sitting on the edge of the porch, looking out over the party. "You okay?" I asked, handing her a fresh drink. She nodded. "Just watching. Looks like we started something." She smiled faintly. "No, they did. We just cleared the path." We sat there for a long time, side by side, letting the laughter drift over us. It felt like the ridge was healing, piece by piece. The next morning we slept in. There were no emails from Karen, no footprints by the porch, no strange shadows in the trees. The cabin was quiet, the kind of quiet that comes from absence, not fear. I made breakfast while Alyssa scrolled through the latest case updates. The county had received 3 more formal complaints from residents, bringing the total to over a dozen. The attorney handling the case had requested a formal hearing. Karen would face a judge in 2 weeks. She shared the update with me over eggs and toast, then closed the laptop and leaned back in her chair. "I think we can finally relax," she said. "You said that once before." I meant it more this time. Later that afternoon, we went for a walk. No trail cams, no radios, just the 2 of us, and the rustle of trees in the breeze. We followed the long path that wound around the lake and stopped at a spot with a perfect view of the water and the hills beyond. Alyssa sat on a flat rock and closed her eyes, the wind tugging lightly at her hair. I sat beside her, quiet. "This place feels different now," I said. She opened one eye and glanced at me. "It feels like ours." I nodded. "Not just ours." She smiled. "Exactly. It was not about ownership. It was about peace, about belonging, about letting the mountain be what it was always meant to be, refuge, not a battleground. For the first time, in a long time, I believed we had found what we came here for. Not just quiet, not just rest, but something deeper, something earned." The cabin stood tall behind us, strong, silent, ours. The courthouse was a plain 2-story building, tucked between a post office and a library in the center of the county seat. It was the kind of place most people drove past without a second glance, its brick exterior weathered by years of wind and sun. There was nothing grand about it, no ornate steps or sweeping entryway. Just a pair of glass doors, a small plaque with the county's name, and a slow trickle of people filing in for traffic tickets, probate hearings, and small claims cases. But today, behind one of those doors, Karen Withers was standing before a judge. Alyssa and I arrived early. She wore the same calm expression she had carried since the day we first caught Karen on the porch. Not rigid, not cold, just focused. The badge stayed tucked away. She was not here to arrest anyone. She was here to testify, to tell the truth and let it speak for itself. I carried a small folder of documents and a copy of the original video footage from our trail cameras. Everything was already submitted to the county attorney, but Alyssa liked to have backups. She had seen too many things fall through cracks made by overconfidence. Inside, the courtroom was quiet and functional. Pale wood benches, a low rail separating the public seating from the legal tables, and a simple seal of the state hanging behind the judge's bench. A bailiff stood by the door, checking names and directing people to their places. We sat in the second row behind the prosecution table, just a few feet from where Karen would be seated. When she entered, she did not look our way. She walked in wearing a pale blue blazer, her grey hair pulled back into a bun so tight it looked painful. Her lawyer, a thin man with an expensive haircut and a cheap suit, kept a firm grip on his folder and a wary glance over his shoulder. Karen's expression was stiff, unreadable, not embarrassed, not regretful, just tense, like a machine wound too tight. She sat slowly, adjusted the cuffs of her blazer, and stared forward. The case was called a few minutes later. The charges were read one by one in the same steady voice the clerk had used for every case before hers. Trespassing on private property, attempted unlawful entry, criminal impersonation of an official, harassment, fabrication of documents intended to resemble government correspondence. When the judge asked how she pleaded, Karen stood and replied without hesitation, "Not guilty, Your Honor." It did not surprise anyone. The prosecution began with a brief overview of the case. They introduced the video footage, copies of the letters Karen had distributed, statements from property owners, and a timeline of her behavior over the past several years. They kept the tone neutral, factual, and methodical. They were not here to make her look bad. They were here to show what she had done. Piece by piece, they built the picture. Then it was Alyssa's turn. She stepped to the witness stand with quiet confidence, was sworn in, and began to answer questions clearly and without emotion. She described the events from our arrival at the cabin to the night of the attempted break-in. She explained the trail camera footage, the contents of the phony letters, and Karen's behavior when confronted. The court played the video from the day Alyssa opened the front door and placed her under citizen's arrest. Karen flinched when the footage showed her trying the door handle. Her lawyer objected once, claiming the evidence was edited out of context. The judge overruled it after a quick review. After Alyssa's testimony, a few more neighbors spoke. Rachel and Marcus. Hank, an older woman named Edith, who had lived on the ridge for nearly 2 decades and had been receiving Karen's letters since the first year she moved in. Each of them offered their own piece of the puzzle. None were dramatic. None were exaggerated. They simply described what had happened to them and how it made them feel. By the time the prosecution rested, the courtroom had shifted. You could feel it in the way the people on the benches sat forward, the way the judge watched more intently, the way Karen's own lawyer seemed to shrink an inch in his chair. The defense was brief. Karen did not take the stand. Her attorney claimed she had acted under the sincere belief that she had authority, that she was trying to maintain standards for the good of the community. He spoke about intent, about her long history on the ridge, and painted her as a misunderstood caretaker trying to fill a leadership vacuum. It was not enough. When the judge finally issued his verdict, his tone was firm but calm. He did not berate her. He did not deliver a long speech. He simply stated that the evidence showed repeated, deliberate actions that went beyond misunderstanding or error. He found her guilty on 3 of the 5 charges. She was sentenced to 6 months probation, mandatory counseling, and a restraining order barring her from contact with any of the residents who had filed complaints. The impersonation charge would be recorded as a misdemeanor. She would not serve jail time, but the record would follow her. Karen sat through the verdict with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her jaw moved once, then stilled. When the judge dismissed the case, she stood, nodded to her lawyer, and walked out without looking back. No words, no apology, just silence. Alyssa and I remained seated for a while. The room emptied slowly, people filtering out in small groups. Hank came by to shake Alyssa's hand. Rachel gave her a hug. Someone clapped her gently on the shoulder and thanked her again. She accepted it all with grace, but kept her voice low. Outside the courthouse, the sun was high in the sky, warm on our faces. The wind stirred gently through the trees lining the street. We stood for a moment, just breathing it in. "Do you think she'll leave?" I asked. Alyssa thought for a moment. "Eventually. People like her don't like to stay where they've been exposed. And if she doesn't, she knows better than to come near us again." We drove back to the cabin with the windows down, letting the cool air rush through the car. The road wound up the ridge, familiar now in a way it had not been weeks ago. At the cabin, we unpacked in silence, then walked down to the lake. The water was still. The trees stood tall around it. Everything felt just as it had the first day we arrived, but now it felt earned. That evening, we sat on the porch with the last of the coffee, watching the sky fade to blue and orange. Alyssa rested her feet on the railing, her eyes calm. "I think I'm ready to just relax now," she said. "No more arrests?" She smiled. "Not unless someone else shows up with a fake title and a lockpick set." I raised my cup to hers, and we sat there, listening to the wind in the trees. Peace had finally come to the cabin, not because we had found it, but because we had defended it, together.